It begins with a feeling you can't quite name. Something's wrong, but you can't put your finger on it. You're walking on eggshells around someone who claims to love you. You're questioning your own reality, your own memories, your own worth. And deep down, in that place you don't want to acknowledge, you know something is eating you alive from the inside out. But Carl Jung, he saw this coming. He saw it all coming. Jung didn't just study the human psyche for fun. He mapped the darkest territories of the human soul. And what he discovered about toxic relationships would make your blood run cold. Because Jung realized that toxic people aren't just mean or selfish or difficult. No, there's something far more dangerous. They're unconscious predators. Jung called it the shadow, that part of every human being that contains all the qualities we refuse to acknowledge about ourselves. The rage, the manipulation, the cruelty, the selfishness we buried so deep we don't even know it's there. But here's the terrifying part. When someone refuses to face their shadow, it doesn't just disappear. It becomes a hungry, desperate thing that feeds on other people's light. And that's exactly what toxic people do. They feed on you. Jung discovered that toxic individuals have what he called an inflated ego. They've convinced themselves they raise superior, special, different from everyone else. But underneath that grandiose mask is a gaping wound of inadequacy so deep, so unbearable, that they'll do anything to avoid feeling it, including destroying you. You think you're in a relationship. You're not. You're in a psychological war zone where one person is fighting for their sanity, while the other is fighting to avoid their own truth. Jung warned that toxic people use what he called projection like a weapon. They take all the darkness they refuse to own and throw it at you like acid. They call you crazy when they're the ones losing their grip on reality. They call you selfish when they're the ones who've never considered another person's needs. They call you manipulative when manipulation is their native language. But here is what Jung knew that most people never figure out. You can't reason with someone who is possessed by their own shadow. You can't love them into healing. You can't sacrifice enough of yourself to fill the void where their self-awareness should be. Because toxic people aren't just hurt. They're unconscious. And unconscious people are dangerous. Jung spent decades studying what he called psychological possession. When someone becomes so identified with their wounded ego that they lose all contact with their authentic self, they become like zombies, driven by primitive impulses they don't understand, leaving a trail of destruction wherever they go, and you become their food source. Jung observed that toxic people have an uncanny ability to find what he called wounded healers, people who are so desperate to prove their worth through fixing others that they'll tolerate the intolerable. They sense your compassion like sharks smell blood in the water. You think you're being loving when you make excuses for their behavior. You think you're being loyal when you accept their lies. You think you're being strong when you endure their cruelty. But Jung would tell you something that might shatter your worldview. You're not being loving. You're being self-destructive. Because here's the dark truth Jung discovered. Toxic relationships aren't accidents. They're unconscious contracts between the people who are both running from themselves. The toxic person runs from their shadow by projecting it onto you. And you run from your own worth by accepting treatment you know you don't deserve. Jung called this dynamic psychological symbiosis to incomplete people, creating the illusion of wholeness through mutual destruction. The toxic person needs someone to blame for their inner chaos, and you need someone to prove your worth too, even if it kills you. But Jung didn't just diagnose the problem. He revealed the solution, and it's not what you think. Jung taught that the only way to break free from toxic relationships is through what he called individuation, the terrifying process of becoming whole within yourself, not through them, not despite them, without them. Individuation means facing your own shadow. It means acknowledging the parts of yourself you've been ashamed of. It means asking the most uncomfortable question a person can ask. What am I getting out of this? Because here's what Jung knew that most people will never admit. On some level, you're choosing this. You're choosing to stay. You're choosing to believe their lies. You're choosing to sacrifice your peace for their drama. And until you face that choice, you'll keep making it. Jung warned that toxic people are like emotional vampires. They can only drain you if you give them access to your life force. They can only manipulate you if you value their opinion more than your own intuition. They can only control you if you're more afraid of being alone than being destroyed. But the moment you start valuing your own peace more than their approval, something magical happens. Their power over you begins to evaporate. Jung discovered that toxic people are terrified of people who know their own worth. They can't manipulate someone who trusts their own reality. They can't gaslight someone who's done the work to know themselves deeply. This is why they'll fight so hard when you start to change. This is why they'll accuse you of being selfish when you set boundaries. This is why they'll rage when you stop accepting their projection. Because you're taking away their drug. You're taking away their ability to avoid themselves by consuming you. Jung taught that the individuated person, the person who has faced their own darkness and chosen to become whole, is like kryptonite to toxic people. Not because they're mean or cold or uncaring, but because they're real. And reality is the one thing toxic people cannot tolerate. But here is the part that will make you uncomfortable. Jung also taught that becoming whole means accepting responsibility for your own patterns. It means asking yourself why you keep attracting or accepting toxic people. It means facing the possibility that your own unhealed wounds have been drawing in people who mirror your own inner chaos. This isn't victim blaming. This is liberation, because when you realize that you have the power to choose differently, you also realize that you have the power to be free. When you stop seeing yourself as a victim of toxic people and start seeing yourself as someone who can learn to recognize and reject toxicity, everything changes. Jung observed that most people would rather blame others for their suffering than take responsibility for their choices. But the ones who are brave enough to face themselves, they become unbreakable. They develop what Jung called psychological immunity, the ability to recognize manipulation before it takes hold. They learn to trust their instincts over someone else's words. They choose their own peace over someone else's chaos. And here is what happens when you reach that place. Toxic people can't stand to be around you. You become like a mirror reflecting back their unconscious behavior, and they can't handle what they see. They'll either have to face themselves or find easier prey. Most of them choose easier prey. Jung spent his life studying the human capacity for self-deception, and he discovered that toxic people are the most self-deceived of all. They built their entire identity around avoiding the truth about themselves, and they need you to participate in that avoidance. But when you stop participating, when you stop enabling their unconsciousness, when you start living from your own truth instead of their delusions, you become something they can't control. You become free. And freedom, Jung taught, is the most dangerous thing to someone who's still in prison. So here is Jung's shocking dark truth about toxic relationships. They reign not really about the other person at all. They're about you. They're about what you're willing to accept. They're about what you believe you deserve. They reign about how much you are willing to sacrifice of your authentic self to maintain the illusion of connection. The toxic person is just the messenger. The message is that you still have work to do. Jung once said that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. And nowhere is this more true than in toxic relationships. The person who drives you crazy with their lies, they're showing you where you're still lying to yourself. The person who manipulates you with guilt, they're showing you where you're still manipulating yourself with shame. The person who refuses to take responsibility, they're showing you where you're still avoiding your own power. This is why Jung called toxic relationships shadow work in disguise. They're not just random torture. They're unconscious attempts to heal old wounds, to finally face the parts of yourself you've been running from. But here's the crucial part. The healing doesn't happen through them. It happens through you. It happens when you stop trying to fix them and start choosing yourself. It happens when you stop explaining yourself to people who are determined to misunderstand you. Now, here's where it gets really dark. Jung discovered that toxic people don't just randomly target anyone. They have an uncanny ability to identify what he called the wounded healer, someone whose childhood wounds have created a compulsive need to save others as a way of proving their own worth. You grew up believing that your value came from how much you could endure, how much you could give, how much you could sacrifice for others. Maybe you had a parent who was emotionally unavailable, and you learned that love meant working harder to earn affection. Maybe you had a chaotic household where you became the peacemaker, the one who held everything together. Jung understood that these early experiences create what he called psychological complexes, unconscious patterns that drive your behavior without your awareness. And toxic people can sense these complexes like predators sense weakness. They know exactly which buttons to push because they're not seeing you as a person. They're seeing you as a collection of exploitable wounds. Jung observed that toxic people have what he called paranoid projection. They constantly scan their environment for threats to their false self. When they meet someone who genuinely tries to understand them, who shows them real compassion, it triggers their deepest terror that they might actually be seen for who they truly are. So they attack. They attack the very thing they crave most, authentic connection. Because authentic connection requires them to be real. And being real means facing the shadow they've spent their entire life running from. This is why toxic people punish you for your kindness. This is why they mock your empathy. This is why they take your love and twist it into a weapon against you. because your genuine care is proof that they could be loved for who they really are, and that possibility is more terrifying than any external threat. Jung called this the fear of individuation, the terror of becoming whole, of integrating all the parts of yourself you've disowned. Toxic people would rather destroy relationship after relationship than face the possibility that they could be different. But here is what Jung discovered that will change everything. Their rejection of you isn't really about you at all. It's about their rejection of themselves. When they call you too sensitive, they're really saying they're terrified of their own feelings. When they say you're too needy, they're really saying they're terrified of their own need for connection. Every accusation is a confession. Every projection is a revelation of their own inner torment. Jung taught that understanding this doesn't mean you should stay and try to save them. It means you should run. Because someone who is that disconnected from themselves is capable of psychological violence. You can't even imagine. They'll gaslight you until you question your own memory. They'll manipulate you until you don't trust your own instincts. They'll isolate you until you forget what healthy relationships even look like. They'll systematically destroy your sense of self until you become a hollow shell of who you used to be. And they'll do it all while convincing you that you're the problem. Jung studied what he called psychic vampirism, the way certain people drain the life force from others to avoid feeling their own emptiness. He discovered that these people literally feed off of your emotional energy, your creativity, your joy, your peace. They'll create drama to get your attention. They'll manufacture crises to keep you focused on them. They'll swing between love bombing and cruelty to keep you in a state of constant anxiety. Because your anxiety feeds their need to feel important, needed, in control. Jung realized that toxic people are addicted to what he called negative attention. They'd rather be hated than ignored because any attention confirms their existence. They'd rather create pain than feel emptiness because pain at least feels like something. And you become their drug dealer. Every time you respond to their drama, you're giving them another hit. Every time you try to explain yourself, you're feeding their addiction. Every time you accept their apology only to watch them repeat the same behavior, you're enabling their avoidance of themselves. Jung warned that the kindest thing you can do for a toxic person is to stop participating in their self-destructs. But most people can't do it because they've confused enabling with love, chaos with passion, drama with depth. They mistake intensity for intimacy. They confuse being needed with being loved. They believe that if they just love hard enough, give enough, sacrifice enough, they can heal someone who refuses to heal themselves. But Jung had a different perspective. He taught that true love sometimes means letting someone hit rock bottom. True compassion sometimes means saying no. True healing sometimes means walking away from someone who's determined to stay sick. Because here is what Jung knew that most people never learned. You can't love someone into consciousness. You can't sacrifice your way into someone's heart. You can't fix someone who's committed to staying broken. Jung observed that toxic people are often addicted to their own victimhood. They've built their entire identity around being wrong, misunderstood, mistreated. They collect grievances. Like other people collect stamps. They need to be the victim because being the victim means they never have to take responsibility for their own choices, and they need you to be the villain in their story. They need you to be the one who's mean, selfish, difficult, impossible to please. Because if you're the problem, then they don't have to change. If you're the one who's wrong, then they can continue living in denial. Jung called this the victim-perpetrator dynamic, where someone hurts you and then makes you responsible for their behavior. They'll push you until you react, then point to your reaction as proof that you're the unstable one. They'll create chaos, then blame you for not being calm enough to handle it. It's psychological warfare disguised as a relationship. Jung taught that breaking free from this dynamic requires what he called radical self-responsibility, the willingness to stop blaming others for your choices and start taking ownership of your own life. This doesn't mean taking responsibility for their behavior. It means taking responsibility for your decision to tolerate it. It means asking yourself the hard questions. Why do I keep attracting people who treat me this way? What childhood wounds am I trying to heal? Through this relationship, what am I afraid will happen if I choose myself over this chaos? Jung discovered that most people are more afraid of their own power than they are of other people's dysfunction. They're more afraid of being alone than being destroyed. They're more afraid of the unknown than they are of the familiar pain. But the individuals who are brave enough to face these fears, they discover something Jung called psychological sovereignty, the ability to govern your own inner world without needing external validation or approval. They learn to trust their own instincts over someone else's words. They develop what Jung called psychological immunity, the ability to recognize manipulation before it takes hold, They choose their own peace over someone else's chaos. And here is what happens when you reach that place. Toxic people can't stand to be around you. You become like a mirror reflecting back their unconscious behavior, and they can't handle what they see. They'll either have to face themselves or find easier prey. Most of them choose easier prey. Jung spent his life studying the human capacity for self-deception, and he discovered that toxic people are the most self-deceived of all. They have built their entire identity around avoiding the truth about themselves, and they need you to participate in that avoidance. But when you stop participating, when you stop enabling their unconsciousness, when you start living from your own truth instead of their delusions, you become something they can't control. You become free. And freedom, Jung taught, is the most dangerous thing to someone who's still in prison. Jung also warned about what he called the helper S-curse, the way some people become addicted to fixing others as a way of avoiding their own problems. If you're always focused on someone else's drama, you never have to face your own emptiness. If you're always playing the savior, you never have to admit you need saving too. This is why toxic relationships are so seductive to certain personality types. They provide an endless source of problems to solve, crises to manage, drama to navigate. They give you a sense of purpose, even if that purpose is slowly destroying you. Jung observed that many people would rather feel needed than feel loved. They'd rather be indispensable than be respected. They'd rather be the fixer than face the possibility that they might be broken too. But here's the shocking truth Jung discovered. The toxic person isn't your problem to solve. They're your mirror. They're reflecting back to you all the ways you've abandoned yourself in the name of love. Every boundary you don't set is a boundary you don't believe you deserve. Every excuse you make for their behavior is an excuse you're making for your own patterns. Every time you choose their comfort over your own truth, you're choosing to remain unconscious. Jung taught that consciousness is always a choice. Every moment, you're either choosing to wake up or choosing to stay asleep. And toxic relationships are the ultimate test of your commitment to your own awakening. Because staying requires you to live in denial. Staying requires you to ignore your intuition. Staying requires you to betray yourself over and over again until you forget who you were before you met them. But leaving requires you to face the possibility that you deserve better. Leaving requires you to trust yourself more than you trust their version of reality. Leaving requires you to choose the unknown over the familiar pain. Jung warned that most people will choose the familiar hell over the unknown heaven. But the few who are brave enough to choose differently, they discover that heaven was always available. They just had to stop settling for hell. So here's Jung's final, most important insight about toxic relationships. They're not really about the other person at all. They're about you. They're about what you're willing to accept. They're about what you believe you deserve. They ray about how much you ray willing to sacrifice of your authentic self to maintain the illusion of connection. The toxic person is just the messenger. The message is that you still have work to do. Jung taught that the individuated person doesn't need to be understood by everyone. They don't need to be accepted by everyone. They don't need to be loved by everyone. They just need to be true to themselves. And when you reach that place, when you finally choose your own truth over someone else's drama, you'll discover something Jung promised. You'll attract people who are also choosing truth over drama. You'll find relationships based on mutual respect instead of mutual destruction. But first, you have to be willing to walk away from the familiar chaos. You have to be willing to choose the unknown peace over the known suffering. So ask yourself Jung's most important question. Are you ready to stop being a victim of toxic people and start being the author of your own story? Because the moment you choose yourself, fully, completely, without apology, the toxic people in your life will have to make a choice to evolve or exit. Either way, you win. The question is, are you ready to win?